Nigeria has signed a new production sharing contract with TotalEnergies and South Atlantic Petroleum Sapetro, covering 2 offshore blocks in the West Niger Delta Basin. The deal awarded under the 2024 licensing round spans about 2,000 square kilometers, with TotalEnergies holding 80% and Sapetro 20%. The contract, the first under the Petroleum Industry Act's reformed framework, includes a $10 million signature bonus, production-linked payments, cost recovery capped at 70%, and strict community and environmental obligations. Regulators say the agreement will boost reserves, attract up to $60 billion in investment, and supports Nigeria's target of producing 3 million barrels daily by 2030. Is that a given? Let's find out. Temitope Kolade, Associate Director, Oil, Gas and Power, Andersen Nigeria, joins me for more on this. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sapetro. Good morning.
Good morning to you too. Now, talk to us. What do you make of this contract?
Well,
Mr. Kolade, if you can hear me, I guess that's probably the network affecting audio and communication right there. But if you can hear me, I'd like you to tell us what you make.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I think you can start all over. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So I was saying that it is a strategic move. It helps to build confidence, going by the fact that deep water operations themselves are higher risk operations compared to the marginal fields, and of course most of the JVs that we have. Some degree of shallow water operations therein. So again, when we think about this as a post-PIE regime sort of investment, it helps us to kind of understand that maybe investors are really seeing these in a good light compared to what they've seen before, and they now think Nigeria is ready to do business within the upstream space.
Right, let's take a dive into the PSC in question. The report says, the newly signed PSCs are aligned with reformed fiscal and governance frameworks developed under Section 85 of the PIE and, of course, Regulation 23, Subsection 1 of the 2022 Petroleum Licensing Round Regulations. I'd like you to talk to us about this and, how this sort of differs from the previous ones.
Okay, thank you very much. So apparently under the old regime of the PSCs, the interested parties, the investors and contractors would typically meet with the federal government and have conversations, and you would find that sometimes the sort of arrangements that are reached are more or less ad hoc. So they are having conversations and they're coming up with specific terms as it would favor either parties. What the new regulation does and what the PIA does with respect to the PSCs that we're now seeing thereafter is saying that we're having a standardized and some sort of codified fiscal framework. For instance, in the past, you could find a situation where some companies were entitled to some investment tax credit, and it operates differently from those who could gain investment tax allowance as some sort of incentives that they would get for operating within those fields. So those are some of the little differences that you would see. And indeed, when you then look at them from a point of calculations and analysis of the numbers, it would make a lot of difference for the investors. And again, you would find that there are clearer regulations with respect to provisions around the host communities. Is more standardized. It's more it's clearer if you think about it, and if you also look at it from the point of even the licensing requirements, it's more rules based. So those are some of the changes that you would see under this new rule. In terms of decommissioning, for instance, it provides standard rules as to say this is how much you should put in a particular fund, and that's the only way you'll be able to take deductions for the fact that when you're done with your operations, you'll be able to do the proper remediation. It's not the case where you're just provisioning and then there is no funds that is being clearly set aside for that. So some of those things have now become standardized, and it aligns with what we're seeing in other parts of the world where they have advanced fields.
Right, specifically now, the fiscal provisions in this particular one include a $10 million signature bonus, production bonuses linked to, output thresholds of 35 million and 100 million barrels, and, profit oil and profit gas splits tied to cumulative production and sales. And you also have a 70% cost recovery cap. Do you think these fiscal terms sort of ensure steady revenues for the Federation, while still incentivizing the consortium to invest and perform?
Well, theoretically, I would say yes. From the point of, $10 million signature bonus is quite some sort of guaranteed receipt for the Federation, and it's some sort of modest performance. Again, when we then look at it and step away from that and look at the production bonuses, it means that the companies, the investors are incentivized to quickly begin to produce and begin to get those bonuses. We'll step away from that again and we'll look at the cost recoverability capped at about 70%. That's relatively generous, again, theoretically speaking. But in terms of the net effect and realistically speaking, it's only when we begin to see the implementation that we'll be able to certify that it really works. And what do I mean by that? We've got to be sure that metering is accurate and that reporting is accurate in terms of what production is done. Do we continue to have issues where there is oil theft, so-called, and people are not reporting what they should report? In terms of cost classification, are we getting realistic cost classification as well, or are there going to be inflated costs? If we say there should be 70% cost recovery, if the investor has recovered more than 70% because it's inflicted some cost, it means that he may have indeed recovered more than the 70%. So in terms of practical things, I think that reliable audits and, of course, enforcement would help to really see how balanced the conversation is in terms of how things are. But theoretically speaking, it looks fair on both sides.
All right, I'm going to take you to this now. I remember you already mentioned one or two of them, but I would like us to look at the several first that this contract sort of introduces to Nigeria's deepwater sector and the implication. The first is probably the fact that, this is the first PSC to comprehensively cover both crude oil and natural gas. I'd like you to speak to us about the implication. And then the contract also explicitly embed provisions for environmental remediation, which you mentioned, decommissioning, and you also talked about, host community development. So since you've talked about these two, I'd like you to focus more on the first one and tell us the implication, what it means for Nigerians.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So if you think about it again, from the point of a coverage of both crude and natural gas, what it means is that going forward, we're not just looking at a situation where it's just about the oil. What had happened in the past is most investors, most companies within the upstream sectors were more focused on the crude and were losing revenue on gas. There was so much gas flaring. Aside from the environmental impact that it had, it also meant that we're losing money when those gas reserves could have been commercialized. So what this does is that when you're getting these licenses, you know that you're responsible for exploring both oil and gas. And it then means that operators will then begin to look at how they can optimize their reservoir development, how do they monetize or commercialize gas alongside the exploration of the oil. And of course, when they're then developing their FPSOs, those are the facilities to store what they've explored. They are thinking about how to also store gas and how to pipe the gas to the stations that need it. And what that means going forward is that we could be getting into that age where, the government has declared as a decade of gas, where we're trying to make all efforts to get as much benefit as we could get from gas. And like you've said, it is a first when we then think about it from an environmental and decommissioning obligations. It's not so much about just creating a provision account, so to speak, but you've got to fund it and ensure that at the end of the life cycle of fields, you can put them back into their, to a state where it's close to how it started from a point of decommissioning, and of course more responsibilities for both the host community and the investor from the requirements of the host community provisions under the PIA.
These all sound good, and just like you said, implementation is key, and that's something we need to watch and ensure that it happens. Though a lot of persons seem to sort of, have confidence in NUPRC in the way it carries out its activities. But of course, time will tell. Now, let's look at this. Before now, we know that Nigeria, had, or let's say, I'll use the word hard. So let's believe this is a new, a new dawn. So let's say Nigeria, used to have this challenge with production sharing contracts, which of course include inadequate metering and underreporting of production, enabling tax avoidance. We saw that, legal and regulatory implementation issues, and also foreign contractual bias. There was also the issue of unfavorable, profit sharing that sort of resulted in significant revenue loss. Are you confident that, these reforms we're saying now will adequately address these challenges that, used to affect these PSCs?
Well, again, it's really not about reforms on paper. Reforms in the implementation, they are in the drive of the agencies of government that are going to ensure that those things get done. And what doesn't get measured, they say, doesn't get done. So starting from metering, it's important that we begin to have investment in independent metering and, of course, strong auditing capacity, real-time data systems, and, of course, stricter penalties also, because it's really not about the contract or the reforms. They won't fix this legacy operational weaknesses. And I like the fact that you like to be optimistic about putting this in the past, but putting it in the past is not going to be in our heads or in our wishes. It's going to be by the relevant government agencies putting the boots on the ground and ensuring that they actually get these things done in reality. And of course, that independent verification is very key to ensuring that this gets done. If you think about it from the point of profit sharing and things around the fiscals and tax avoidance, you would also realize that we at the same time have the Nigeria Tax Act coming on stream effective January 2026. And the requirement going forward is that royalty collections will now go to the NRS, that the Nigerian Revenue Service, which is the current defunct FRS. So capacity building will be very critical in terms of getting these things done. You can imagine that some officials of the NUPRC may be seconded to the FRS, now the NRS, to ensure that things get done differently. But that handshake and the readiness, the goodwill, the political goodwill and institutional capacity to get things done will really be important for how things will be done going forward. And the readiness to ensure that we have effective enforcement, transparency, and of course, investment in metering tools or devices.
Right. So who do you think should take the lead in ensuring that these investments are, put in place? The government, private sector players, or we need to incentivize them to play more in that particular regard?
Well, I think that the head, most times when you look at where the head rots from for a fish, it's I mean the fish rots from, it's typically from the head, right? So who is the head here? Is the regulator, in my view. So the tone at the top is very critical, whatever it is that we're having conversations about. And I think that the regulators will have to take the initiative to say, this is how we want things run. And of course, there would have to be an handshake with the private investors to ensure that they align with those things. You would find that sometimes it is just the regulators are laxing or not doing things the way it ought to be done, that allows things to appear that it's not working as it ought to. So it's important, in my view, that we ensure that as regulators, we are holding the regulators to account to say, hey, this is what you have said. Are you asking the right questions? Are you asking for the right reports? And are you enforcing where things are not being done the way they should be done? That, for me, is very critical. And of course, we can expect that the private investors will just align with whatever tone that is being set from the top.
Well, let's look at some of the reactions we've seen so far. Well, this may not be a reaction anyway, because it's from the NNPC Group Chief Executive, Bayo Ojulari. According to him, he's saying that this sort of, moves Nigeria toward, the target of achieving, or let's say producing 3 million barrels per day by 2030. And he also stated that achieving that target would require not only exploration and development of new blocks, but also significant new capital inflows of up to $60 billion over the next 5 years. Is this ambitious or achievable?
Well, it's ambitious, but ambition doesn't mean that we can't attain to those things. But there are several ifs, there are several conditions, right? We must be able to get to FID's final investment decisions for a number of projects that are in the pipeline. We need to be able to revitalize existing fields if we're going to achieve those numbers that the GMD is referring to. I mean, we also need to attract several international players. And if you then think about it from the point of what is happening elsewhere in the world, you would find that capital doesn't sit idle. When Nigeria was contemplating whether to pass the PIA or not, some capital that should come to Nigeria had gone to some other parts of Africa. So what does that mean for us going forward? Are we going to then invest in having a predictable fiscal and regulatory system and improve security and social license to ensure that investors indeed are ready to come into Nigeria? The issue usually is that you would find that the environment, the investment climate is not conducive enough for people to operate, or there is no sanctity of contract, and so people enter into contract and then things change down the line. So it's important that government demonstrates that they are really ready to play fair and square on this game, and then they're able to attract the right investors. I think that very critical to having those numbers achieved, right? So again, it's ambitious, but it's achievable if some of those conditions are met, and if we can begin to implement these reforms in a credible way and very quickly at that.
Well, it's no news that Nigeria's production to reserve ratio remains low. So talk to us, in your own opinion, beyond what the government is currently doing, what again must be done, or what other recommendations do you have for boosting production?
Well, I think the first is to not just depend solely on the deep water fields where we have very huge investments or capital outlay that are required to ensure that those works. What's happening with our marginal fields or the dormant fields? I think government needs to revitalize those conversations as well. It's also important to then begin to have conversations around reservoir management, the conversations around digital twins on how to improve those mature fields and to boost recovery from them. I think overall it's important to strengthen the fight against corruption and, of course, ensure that there is transparency when it comes to revenue generation and declaration or disclosure, so that we can have the right people coming into the market and saying that, yes, indeed, we think that Nigeria is ready for business. And if there is any other thing to do, I think it's important to also prioritize gas infrastructure development to ensure that we're doing a lot with respect to our gas to power projects and complement those fiscal reforms. So if we're going to lift the production from where it is right now, we've got to boost a lot of confidence in the market and investors to be ready to put their monies into the Nigerian markets and ensure that going forward, things are not the usual.
Right. Temitope Kolade, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts on Business Edge today.
Thanks for having me.
I've been speaking with Temitope Kolade, Associate Director, Oil, Gas and Power, Andersen Nigeria. Well, we'll take a breather, and when we come back, we'll bring you international business stories. Stay with us.